Hello everyone and thanks for joining me for this new video. And if you're new here, I'm Cedric. I'm the creator of OxyProps, a WordPress plugin to help agencies and freelancers to be more efficient when building websites with Oxygen Builder or Bricks Builder. And on my channel, you will find videos about the plugin, of course, but also about using various web technologies, CSS, JavaScript, and even frameworks like React with your favorite page builder. And talking about technologies, today we will have a look at the Stripe homepage, and in particular two aspects of the Stripe homepage, this animated gradient and also this text effect where you have a color blend mode between the text and the gradient background. And this is what we will build together in Bricks today. I will be using Bricks Builder, but if you are an Oxygen builder, stay with us. You will be able to do exactly the same. And if you want to follow along with me, you will find in the video description a link to a GitHub repository where you will find all the custom code, the JavaScript code we will use, and you will also find both for Bricks and for Oxygen, JSON files with the complete structure that you can copy and paste into your page builder to get the exact same structure as I have here. So you can notice that we have this animated gradient and we also have this text blending effect. And of course, I will be using OxyProps, my plugin. And if you know me, you know that when we build with OxyProps, we get access to light and dark mode support. So I have a light and dark mode toggle. And if I use it, you will notice that both our text and our animated gradient are responsive to light and dark modes. Okay, a last word before we start. To create the gradient, we will use JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript. It's not extremely complicated, but it will be a bit long. I will take time to explain in detail and step by step what we are doing with this code. So if you are not interested in understanding the JavaScript, feel free to use the timestamp in the video description and jump to the next chapter. But if you are like me and you like to understand precisely what is happening, stay with me and you will discover how to use the Canvas HTML element to insert a graphic on your page and how to use JavaScript to give life to this graphic. So let's open a new blank page in Bricks. So here we are in Bricks. It's a completely blank page. I have activated OxyProps light mode, so we will work in light mode. I usually use dark mode, but to match a Stripe homepage, we will use the light version. And I will start by adding a div to my page. You actually don't need a div, but it is only here. So I have a unique container that I can just copy and paste to export the structured JSON for you. Okay, inside of my div, I will add a section inside the div. And I will also add the OxyProps light and dark toggle. I place it outside of my container. My section will have, and I'm using OxyProps context panels to add classes and CSS custom properties. But of course, if you're not yet using OxyProps, you can create your own custom classes and enter your own values. And I will give my section a padding block of 7. And if you are not familiar with CSS logical properties, a padding block is a logical property then and corresponds to padding along the block axis, which for left to right languages is top bottom. My section will also have a position relative because I will position things absolutely. And as I will play with z-index, I want to create a stacking content at my section level. So I will add the class isolate. Perfect. So my toggle will have a size of size 2 and it will be absolutely positioned inside my section. And let's give it a top of size 2 and a right of size 2. So it's on top right of our page. Perfect. And for the icon color, let's simply use our surface 3 and surface 4 on hover. Perfect. So we will first work on our gradient, but Just to know where we are going inside of our container, let's add an H1. I will give it a font size of 6. This will be the financial infrastructure structure of the internet. And I want to give it a maximum width of 10 ch and a line height of 0. Perfect. That's it for now. We will come back to our heading later when we are ready with the gradient. So to take care of our gradient, we will add another element inside the section, not inside the container. And I will start by adding a div, but that's not a div tag that I want as the HTML tag. That's a canvas tag. So first, let's rename it so we know what we are working with. And then for the HTML tag, let's select a custom one and change it to a canvas. So a canvas is an HTML tag that is especially intended to receive graphic elements handled with JavaScript. So first, our canvas will be absolutely positioned inside of our section. So let's give it a position absolute. Let's give it an inset of 0. This will set top, left, right, bottom to 0. I want to give it a width of 100% and a height of 50 VH. And just for us to be able to see it, let's give it a background color, and I will set the background color to my brand color. Okay, so here it is. Of course, now my text is hidden, so I want my canvas to have a z-index of -1. So our text is back. And I want to give it this skew shape. And there are several ways to do it, but I will use custom CSS and I will use a clip path. So let's go to CSS, our custom CSS. I will right click just to give me the wrapper root and the curly brackets because I'm a bit lazy and I won't want to type. So let's take this one, get rid of the property, but I have the wrapper. And I want to give it a clip path of, that will be a polygon. And the polygon takes several properties. And what we will define are the 4 corners. We want a polygon with 4 corners, one at the top left, top right, one somewhere here in the middle, and then the last one at the bottom left. So the first value we define is the top left, which is 0, 0, comma. The second one is the top right, which is 0, 100%. Then the next one is, and maybe it will be 1/3 of the height, so it will be 33%, 100%. Let me enlarge, and I just noticed that I inverted the values between the horizontal and the vertical axis. That's the opposite, 133%. And the last one will be 0, 100%. So let's zoom back, and we have our clip path defined by this value. Okay, so the coordinates for the clip path start from top left. The first value is the horizontal axis. That's why it's 100%. And 0 on the vertical axis for the second point, second corner here. And then it's 100% on the horizontal axis and 33% vertical. Okay, the way this polygon works is that we can add as many corners as we want. For example, we could have a corner here with 50%, 50%, comma, and this adds an additional point in the middle. Okay, so that's quite easy to use. Let's come back to this value. And that's it for the element, but now we need to take care of the graphics because we just gave some CSS properties that define the dimensions and position the canvas on our page. But the canvas HTML element needs specific attributes, needs a height and a width attribute. These will not be the visual height and width, but this will be the height and width used as coordinates to define the graphics inside of our canvas. So to create those width and height attributes, these are not our width and height, that's CSS for the visual aspect, but we need to go to the attributes, and we will start by defining two attributes. The first one will be width, and let's give it a value of 30 and create another one that will be our height with a value of 30. Let's save, and let's have a quick look at our front end. And I just want to open our dev tools to show you those attributes. And here it is. Let's enlarge the text so it's well visible for you. So we created a canvas HTML element, and we just set those attributes of width 30 and height 30. And by the way, we will need an ID for our JavaScript. So let's go back to bricks and give our canvas an ID of conv. You can name it whatever you want, but if you are using or reusing the JavaScript from my repository, it needs to be the same ID. So that's conv, C-A-N-V, okay, for the ID. Okay, so back to our structure, we will need to write some JavaScript. So let's add a code element. I don't want it inside my canvas. I want it on the same level. So let's zoom so you can see. Let's get rid of everything and start by opening and closing a script tag. Okay, so the first thing we need is to get access to our canvas. So we'll define a constant. We will name it gradient canvas. You can name it anyway, but let's use this name so we are on the same page. And this element will be equal to my document, which is my global page dot get element by ID, which is a method that will look inside the document for an element with the ID of conv we just defined, semicolon. So now inside this gradient canvas constant, we have our element and we can work with it. And in order to be able to create our graphic, our gradient, we need to access what is called the context of the canvas. So let's create a new constant that will be my canvas context, which is equal to my gradient canvas, the element I just grabbed. Look inside of it for a method named getContext, which is available for canvas elements. And there are several possible contexts depending on the complexity of the graphics you want to create. The exact stripe animated gradient is quite a complex one. We will create a simpler one. And so we will use a context of 2D, which will allow us to create a 2 dimensions element. With the same technique, you can create complex 3D elements using a context of WebGL, for example. Okay, and while we are here, let's create 2 additional constants because I want to get in my script the width and the height I just defined as custom attributes. So let's create a constant canvas width, which will be equal to my gradient canvas dot get attribute. And I just need to pass to this method the name of the attribute with it, which is the width. And let's just copy and paste the same line, and my canvas height will be my height. Okay, the reason why I'm creating these values instead of just repeating the value of 30 inside my script is that I want the element to be dynamic. So once we are finished writing this JavaScript, you can change values on the element custom attributes. And for example, by changing the width and the height, this will be dynamically applied in our script, so in our animation. I know that it's not clear yet what those width and height values are doing, so stay with me for now. Now we will create a JavaScript function, and we will use the ES6 arrow function syntax. So let's create a constant of set color. This will be equal to a pair of parentheses, and we'll come back to the parameters later. Arrow symbol equal greater than, opening curly brackets. Let's drop down, and in between those curly brackets, we will write our function. And we will pass our function 5 parameters: x, y, r, g, b. Okay, so maybe you kind of understand what are those parameters. X and y will be coordinates, and RGB will be 3 components of an RGB color. And now let's discuss what are those width and height attributes for the canvas. When I did set the width and the height to 30 for both attributes, this defines our canvas as a 30 by 30, whatever unit, but it's just a coordinate system of 30 by 30, and we will draw graphics inside of this coordinate system. So we can imagine a grid, a kind of grid, for example, with 30 columns, 30 rows, and cells in the inside. And this function will state for each of the cell at the coordinates x and y a color with the components r, g, and b. Okay, so for example, if I want to set the color of the top left cell, the top left square, that will be an x of 1, a y of 1. So my first square on top left will be whatever color I will pass. So we need to give 2 elements to this function, and we will define properties to our canvas context. So let's call our canvas context, which is still this element. And we want to define, so dot, fill style, and this will be equal to, and we will spell out an RGB function. So that's RGB plus our parameter R for the red component plus a comma plus G for the green, another comma, B for the blue component plus the closing parentheses, and we are finished. So we are filling this cell with an RGB color of R, G, and B. And then we need to define precisely which part to fill with this color. So we will define in our canvas context a fill rectangle, fill rect. Make sure you use the capitalized character. That's usually the way we write things in JavaScript. And we will define this rectangle by giving the coordinates. So the first 2 parameters are the top left corner, which is x and y, the 2 parameters we are passing to the function. And then we want to color elementary squares of 1 by 1. So we give the dimensions of the rectangle and with no unit because we are giving dimensions in our canvas coordinate system of a width of 30 and a height of 30. So we want it to be 1 in width and 1 in height. Okay, so now let's create a new function that will be a const of generate that canvas equal parentheses, arrow symbol, curly brackets. Let's drop down. And now we will loop through every cell in our canvas. So we will use for loops. The first one will be for x equals 0, x less or equal to my canvas width that we did set for to 30. So this will go from 0 to 30, x plus plus to increment it at each iteration, curly brackets. Let's use another one, and to save time, I will copy and paste the line. This time it will be y, for y equals 0 to our canvas height, y plus plus. And now, what we will do for each cell, well, we will set our color. And remember, we need to give it 5 parameters. First, the coordinates of the cell we want to color. So that will be x and y. And then the RGB values. So just for a test for now, let's give to the red component the value of x plus y, for the G component value of x, and for the y component a value of y. This has no specific meaning, that's just for the demo and to make sure that all of our cells, all of our squares have different colors. And now what we need to do is to call this function. So let's just call it generate that canvas, a pair of parentheses, semicolon. Let's give this a save and choose to execute code. By the way, so now it's a bit tricky because nothing is visible inside of bricks, but let's go to our front end and refresh our page and nothing happens. It looks like I misspelled something. Let's have a look at our console. Okay, so it looks like I have an unexpected column somewhere. So let's go back to our code. Okay, that's certainly here. There should be a semicolon instead of a column. Let's save. Clear the console, refresh. And I misspelled canvas context. There's an O somewhere. Here it is. That's why it's sometimes interesting to copy and paste. And I'm seeing another mistake here. We are on this line in the Y for loop, and when copy pasting, I left an X. Make sure you change everything when you copy and paste. We must have a Y. Otherwise, the condition will never be met and we will be in an infinite loop. So that's a Y. And also maybe before we check on front end, these will be low values. So let's add multipliers, 4 times x plus y, 8 times x, and 8 times y. Let's save and go back to the front end and refresh. And that's nice. We now have a colored gradient in our canvas. Perfect. So that's the beginning, but for now, the canvas has a gradient, but that's a fixed gradient. So next step will be to animate it. And in order to take the time into account, let's add a new element. So let's create a variable, let t, and we'll initialize it to 0. And then within our loop, we will increment this variable t equal t plus, let's add a small value, 0.01. And then let's call a method on the window object. So that's window dot request animation frame, and this method will execute on each frame refresh of the browser. And what we want to do is to execute the same one again. So what we want to execute is generate that canvas. And we don't use parentheses here because we are not telling JavaScript to execute the function right now. We are just giving the name of the function. We pass it as a reference, telling the method to execute, generate that canvas on each refresh. And just to give you a look at what this does, we can just console.log t, and let's have a look. Open the console and refresh, and you see the value that is incremented because it's executed each time. Okay, so now we have a variable that changes with time, and we can use it to animate our gradient. And to animate our gradient, we will modify our setColor function. So let's drop down on different lines so we can clearly see what will happen here. And we will replace those values by creating functions. So let's create a first one. It will be the red component of the color, parentheses, and we will give to this function parameters of x and y, but also our t value. And that's it for now. Only three parameters for now. We will add one later, but let's go step by step. Let's create a green component and finally a blue component. And as we have called this function, well, we should have actual functions with those names. So let's create them and start with the red component. And let's create an arrow function. We are giving it three parameters. And we want this function to return a value. And for the value we want to return, we will make a calculation. So for each of the components, the red, the green, and the blue component, we want to return a value between 0 and 255 to feed our RGB function here. And a bit later, we will make things more dynamic. But for now, let's say that we have a part of this value that will be fixed and a part that will be variable. So let's start with the fixed part. And let's say, for example, that the fixed part is 75% of the total value. So 75% of 256 will be 192. So we want to return 192 plus, and then the variable part will be 64 for a total of 266. And we want to modulate this value based on our parameters. So we want to multiply this value by something that will have a value between 0 and 1. So the total value we return will vary between 192 and 255. And something that varies between 0 and 1, in math, there are handy functions that are the sinus and the cosinus. So for this one, let's use a math.cos, C-O-S, and I will give you the formulas. You can use this one, and later you can play with them to change things. But for now, let's go with a set of parentheses, x times x to have an x to the square, minus y times y times y. And let's divide this by 300 and add our t variable. And we want to round this value. So to round it, we will add a math.floor to this total calculation. Let's create the next one. The next one will be our green component, and I will recycle this one. green. And this time we want to change the formula. This will be a sinus this time, so math.sin. We will still use x to the square, but multiply it by math dot cosinus of t over 4. And then we will add y to the square. So maybe let's make it more readable and drop down on several lines. So y to the square times math dot sinus of t over 3 divided by 300. Okay, and I think we are good with the parentheses. I know these formulas are a bit complex, but they are just there to give us a pattern of color. So let's create the last one, and that will be our blue component. And this one will return so still 64 multiplied by math.sinus of 5 times math.sinus of t over 9 plus x minus 100 times x minus 100 times plus y minus 100 times y minus 100. And all this will be divided by 1100. And we should be good with the parentheses. Let's check. Looks like I have one too many. So now we have our functions. So remember, we have this generate canvas function that will execute at each frame refresh. We have added a time parameter, and this time parameter will be slightly increased during each iteration. So we will call this function for each of the cells of our canvas, but with an additional parameter that will change over time. This way, the exact value of the calculated component of the color will vary slightly at each iteration. So let's have a look. I hope I didn't misspell something. Let's go to our front end and refresh. And that's perfect. We now have a gradient, and you see that the color is slightly varying. If we want this to be faster, so it's easier to see, we can go back to our script and modify the increment. So maybe use 0.1. Let's save, and I will refresh. Take care if you are sensitive to moving colors, because this will be much faster. Let's refresh. Okay, so now you can see that our gradient is varying much faster. Okay, so we see that this value can modify the speed of the animation. Let's go back to 0.01. But we can also have the fixed part and the variable part varying. For example, if I want more red, I can change my value to 200, and this one will be 56. And maybe my green component, I want a very low fixed value and a big variable part. And if we have a look at the result, we have a different gradient with more red and much more variation in the green component. Okay, so to continue, let's make our script more dynamic. And I'll go back to my canvas and add additional attributes. For now, we have width and height. And I will add more attributes. This one will be red. And what I want to do here is to give a relative contribution of each of the components to the final color. And this will be a value between 0 and 1. For example, this one will be 0.9, meaning that I will have a maximum of 90% of red in my final color. This will allow us to create a gradient that can match your side color or your brand color if you want more red, less green, more blue in your color. This can be defined using those attributes. So let's do the same for green. And let's go with 0.6. Blue will be 1. I will create another one that is the variable part. And this will define how much of each of the component is variable. So remember, we did define 192 as the fixed part, 64 as the variable part. So this will also be a value between 0 and 1. And I can, for example, define that 0.33. So 1/3 of each component will be the variable part. And finally, I will create a last one, which will be the dark ratio. And this one will be used to adjust our gradient to light and dark mode. And I will set this one to 0.45. Let's save and go back to our code. And now let's use our new attributes. So the first thing we want to do is to get those attributes. So the first one will be my red ratio, and this will be the attribute red. Let's copy this one 2 times. I will have my green and my blue ratio with my blue attribute. Now I'll get my variable part. My attribute is variable dash part. And I will get my dark ratio, which is our dark dash ratio. So let's use them, and we will start with our red component, and let's drop down to another line. So you remember, this first line is the fixed part, and then we add a variable part. So let's create our fixed part, and we will use a math.floor to round it. And what will we round? Well, this will be the total, 256. As I am rounding my value, actually, I use 256 to get a maximum of 255. So I will use 256 multiplied by parentheses 1 minus my variable part. Okay, because this one is the fixed part. So if my variable part is 0.25, for example, I will use 1 minus 0.25, which is 0.75, 75% for my fixed part. And then we will multiply this by our red ratio. How much of red do we want as a maximum in our color? Okay, and now for the variable part, we want to replace this 56 by something else. And this something else will be 256 times. This time, this will be directly my variable part times our red ratio. And we still have this function to create the variation. Okay, so let's copy this one because it will be similar for the next one. For the green, our fixed part will be our green ratio, and our variable part will be our green ratio. Okay, we are still using the same formula to calculate the relative fixed part and the relative variable part. And let's do the same for our blue component. This will be our blue ratio. And for the variable part, let's replace this 64 with our blue ratio. Okay, let's save. And if we check, it should still work. And it does. We still have our animated gradient, but this time the calculations takes into account the attributes we did set for our canvas element. Let's make sure this works well. Back to our canvas element, attributes, and let's say, for example, that we want a very low contribution of green, let's say 0.1. Blue is set to 1 and maybe 0.5 for red. So we should have mainly red-blue result. And let's say that the variable part will be very high, 75%. Let's save and check the result, and we should have something different. Very low green, mainly blue and red. So this is working. Let's keep a high variable part and let's bring green back to 0.6 and red to 0.9. And we will continue by adapting our gradient to light and dark mode, because for now, if we switch between light and dark mode, of course, our text is responsive because it uses our text logical color, but the gradient is not changing between light and dark mode. But what I would want to do is have lighter colors in light mode and darker colors in dark mode, of course. So let's try to do this, and going back to our code, we did set this dark ratio, so let's use it. And actually the way we will use it is that for each color, the lower value we have for the R, G, and B component, the darker the color will be. And we need to adapt it to the color scheme. So let's create a variable, let color scheme, and this will be equal to our document dot first element child, and the first element child in an HTML document is the HTML element, and this is where OxyProps sets the attribute for the color scheme. So that's what we want to get here. So we will get the attribute, and the attribute we want to get is color-scheme. And depending on the state of our light-dark toggle, the color scheme will be either light or dark. And then we want our actual dark ratio, the one we will use, will be different depending on the mode. So this will be equal to, and we will use a ternary operator. So that's a simple way to write an if statement, because we will state a condition that will be our color scheme, and we will check if this is equal to light, and then we add a question mark, and then a column and a semicolon, and whatever we will state after the question mark and before the colon will be what is executed if the condition is true, meaning the color scheme is equal to light, and after the colon will be executed if the condition is false. So if this is true, we want a value of 1, and if this is false, meaning we are in dark mode, we want a value of dark ratio coming from our attribute. So we did set our attribute to 0.45. So if we are in dark mode, the value will be 0.45. If we are in light mode, the value will be 1. So now let's use it. And to use it, let's add to our functions an additional parameter, which will be our actual dark ratio. And we will simply adjust the value with this ratio. So we add a multiply here and our actual dark ratio. And we do the same for the variable part. Same thing for the green component, and don't forget to pass it as a parameter. And also for the variable part, our blue component. So that's okay for our component functions. And remember, if it's difficult to follow or if something is not working as expected, you can find this code in the GitHub repo. And finally, in our generate canvas function, we need to add this as a parameter passed to the functions. But we also need to check each time if the color scheme has changed. Let's get rid of this console log. So first, we will get the attribute. So color scheme, we could copy and paste what we wrote earlier, but let's write it again. This is equal to document dot first element child dot get attribute, and the attribute we want to get is our color dash scheme. And this time we are not using the ternary operator because we will have, when we will deal with the text, a little something to add. So this will be an if parenthesis curly bracket else parenthesis curly bracket, no parenthesis, only curly bracket for the else, sorry, statement. And as a condition, we will check if our color scheme is equal to light. And if it is, our actual dark ratio will be equal to 1. And if it is not, it will be equal to our dark ratio. Let's save. And if I did not misspell something, this should work. So let's go back to our front end. Maybe let's make something quite bright. So back to our attributes. Let's increase the value for green and let's check our front end again. So this is the light version and let's switch to dark. And this is the dark version. You see that we have much darker components for our red, green and blue channels. So now our gradient is responsive to our light and dark mode. That's perfect. Maybe the light mode is still a bit dark sometimes. That's because I gave a big value for the variable part. So let's reduce it maybe to 25%. And we will get this way lighter colors because the fixed component will be high. You see that it's much lighter. Okay, so now let's take care of our text because we would like our heading to be somewhat blended with our gradient. So let's go back to our container. We will give our container a class of relative because we want to position our text absolutely. And we will duplicate this text several times. So the text will have a position absolute. And let's give this one at the ID level a Z index of -1. So this one will be hidden behind our gradient. And this is necessary because later we will use filters for the colors and we need a background so our text remain visible on the white background in spite of this filter. So this text, we want to give it doesn't have to be very visible, but we will give it an opacity of 30%, okay, and we will give it a light color. So on our typography, we'll give it a color of maybe our surface too. Okay, so it's there. It's not very visible, but that will be enough for our filter. Let's duplicate the text. And the second one will have a color of text too. We want an opacity of 100%. We want this one to be a layer 2, so it is visible. And we will use, I'm not sure if this is directly possible in Bricks. It's possible in Oxygen. No, so let's create custom CSS. Let's take anything to have our wrapper. And what we want is a mix-blend-mode of, I'll enlarge it so you can see it, mix blend mode of color-burn. Okay, you see that this modifies things. Our text kind of blinds into the background color. And we want control over this to manage light and dark mode. So we will give it an ID of blend dash heading. So we can access it with JavaScript. And as we are duplicating this text for accessibility reason, we want to add an attribute of area hidden with a value of true. And this is because we don't want screen readers to repeat this text 2 times. It's only for decorative purpose that we duplicate the text. So the first one will be the one seen and read by screen readers, and the other ones, because we will have 3 in total, will be hidden to screen readers. So finally, let's duplicate it once again. And the third one will not have this mix blend mode. We'll have a color of text 2, that's okay, but we'll have an opacity of 30%. Okay, so what this overlay does is that it darkens our text. Let's save. And before we go to the front end to check our final result, let's go back one more time to our code. And now maybe we will go and have a look at the front end to see why we need to go back to our code once again. So front end, let's refresh. And I will zoom so we can see it. And we can see this color blend effect between the text and the background. Okay, so now let's check what happens when we switch to dark mode. And that's not great because the filter we did set, the mix blend mode of color burn, is good for the light mode, but is not light mode, so on a light background, but it's not so good for the dark one. So we need to change our filter to use, let's say, the opposite of color burn, which is color dodge. And that's where we will use JavaScript for the last time. So let's get our code. Okay, and let's create another constant. And I will copy this first one because what I want is get my text element by ID. My constant will be my blend heading. That's the heading that has the blend mode. And we will get the document by ID, the element by ID of blend dash heading. Okay, so we have now our element and we can manipulate it. And to manipulate it, we will go down here to our generate that canvas function. And remember this if else statement. Well, here we have the 2 conditions where our color scheme is light or dark. That's where we change the dark ratio. So we will also use our blend heading dot, and we will look into it for the style attribute. And inside of the style, we will take care of the mix blend mode. And you notice that when we manipulate CSS in JavaScript, Remember, in CSS, the property is mix-blend-mode that is set to color burn. Well, in JavaScript, we don't have those dashes, those hyphens, and the dash and the first letter are replaced together with the capital letter. That's why we have mix blend mode with capitalized word. Mix blend mode, capitalized, is the JavaScript version of the CSS property. So when we are in light mode, this will be set to color-burn. And let's copy this line. And for the dark mode, let's replace it by a color dodge. Let's save. And hopefully this works. And this should be the final version of our animated gradient hero section. Let's refresh. And this is much better. So this is the dark version, and this is the light version of our blended text. Let's have a look closer. Perfect. And because of the way this mix blend mode works, depending on the actual color of our text, it will be more or less visible. If our text, here we are in dark mode, the text is very light, the effect is not very visible. So if we want it to be more intense, we can adjust this color. So to adjust the color, we can go to our dashboard in OxyProps settings. Let's go to our color settings for the canvas color. And we want to adjust the dark mode for our text too, and we want to make it darker. So let's try 100, why not? Save, and let's try again. So maybe that's too much. I'll go to 85, save, refresh, and here we are. So maybe one last thing, you remember that we did set our canvas width and height attributes to 30. What happens when we change those values? Well, let's go to our canvas in the custom attributes and change maybe the width to 60. So take care, because the greater the values, the more cells we have in our gradient, so the more calculations our scripts will require. And if you go to very high values, this will be resources heavy, and this will pump a lot of resources from your machine. So take care, don't set too high values, but for example, let's try with 50 for the height, and we add 60 for the width. Let's save. Back to our front end. Let's go to the light mode and refresh. So this changes the pattern. This changes the number of cells we have in our canvas. And this version uses more resources, but also has more various colors. And this is how we can create this stripe hero section animated gradient and blending text effect in your favorite page builder, either Bricks or Oxygen, using OxyProps and using your new JavaScript skills. As usual, I hope you enjoyed it. Tell me in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you don't own OxyProps yet, well, it's time to grab the deal. It's still a lifetime deal. I wish you very pleasant site builds, and I'll see you in the next video.